It's London, 1888, a city choking on its own progress. The air hangs thick with smog. Horse-drawn carriages rattle over cobblestone streets. Gas lamps flicker in alleyways where the rich parade in top hats, while the poor drown in gin and desperation. Telegraph wires hum with the promise of a modern world, but in the East End, something older, darker, is about to rise. Because while Queen Victoria celebrates 50 years on the throne, a killer is sharpening his blade in Whitechapel, an area crime-ridden and violent. This is Crime Stands Still at Deep Cuts, and today we're investigating Jack the Ripper. August 31st, 1888, at 3:40 in the morning, Mary Ann Nichols, known as Polly to her friends, is found in Buck's Row, her throat slashed, her abdomen ripped open. 1 month later, Annie Chapman is discovered in a backyard on Hanbury Street, her throat cut, womb removed, and for the first time police suspect the killer has surgical skills. 2 weeks later, the Central News Agency receives a letter, one that mocks police failure and promises more blood. It's signed, "Yours truly, Jack the Ripper." And with that signature, a legend was born. 3 days later, 2 more women, all in the same night. Elizabeth Stride found on Burner Street, throat slashed, but no mutilation. Police believed the killer was interrupted. Just 45 minutes later, Catherine Eddowes found in Meter Square, her face mutilated beyond recognition, her uterus and left kidney taken. Nearby, a chilling clue, a bloody piece of her apron, left beneath anti-Semitic graffiti, igniting fear of racial unrest. 2 months later, Mary Jane Kelly, found in her room at 13 Miller's Court. She is unrecognizable. Skinned, dismembered, her organs displayed around the bed like trophies. Can you imagine that macabre scene? Lungs, heart, head, kidneys, propped up, bloodied, on the corners of her bed. The public outrage exploded. Newspapers called it the Autumn of Terror. It was a manhunt destined to fail before it ever began. Because in 1888, forensic science was little more than guesswork. No fingerprints, no blood typing, no DNA. All police had were the words of terrified witnesses, half-seen shadows, and the crude sketches of crime scenes that were already contaminated by curious onlookers. And yet, every morning, the press fed the public another headline. Another mutilated body, another failure. And for the first time in England's history, an emerging, literate working class devoured the news in real time, their outrage growing with every unsolved murder. The city's poor, the immigrants, the women who walked those dangerous streets, they demanded justice. But justice never came. Pressure mounted. The fear boiled over, and when the city finally lost faith in its protectors, the failure was swift. Both the police commissioner and the Home Security Secretary were forced to resign. There were suspects. There was Montague John Druit, 31-year-old lawyer, and part-time school teacher from a respected middle-class family. That always stops me short. He was a lawyer and a school teacher. So did lawyers not make enough money back then? I don't know. So this is how he was discovered as a suspect. In December of 1888, just weeks after the final Ripper murder, Mary Jane Kelly, Druit was found dead in the River Thames of a suicide. A senior police official, Sir Melville Macnaghten, later named Druit in his 1894 memorandum as a strong suspect. He said that Druit had, I love this. This is a quote, sexual insanity. And he died, quote, at about the same time as the last murder. That's how he became a suspect in 1888. No other evidence than that, just he was sexually insane. So the police looked at the timing of his death, they aligned it with the end of the murders, and they speculated about his instability and his deviance, but it wasn't actually evidence, right? I mean, nothing directly linked Druit to the crime scenes or the victims, but that was just, extra, I guess. I mean, unnecessary maybe, right? His background, this is what I loved, his background as a lawyer seemed at odds, this is a quote, at odds with the anatomical skill suggested by the mutilations. That's in the record. All right, moving on. Next suspect, Walter Sickert. You gotta love these names, right? Sickert. Who was Walter Sickert? Well, he was a well-known English painter with an obsession with violence and death in his art. Yeah, well, that would make him number one suspect, right? So he was discovered. Well, this is interesting. I love Patricia Cornwell. I am a huge fan of hers. She wrote a book on Jack the Ripper where she accused Sickert publicly in the early 2000s of being Jack the Ripper. She spent millions of dollars investigating him, citing similarities between his artwork and the Ripper crime scenes, which is actually a fascinating theory if you think about it. I mean, I found the book fascinating. Cornwell claimed to have found DNA on Sickert's letters that matched the Ripper's letters. So his paintings depicted graphically violent scenes that included mutilated female figures, which is really interesting. And Cornwell claimed that the paper that was used for Ripper's letters matched Sickert's stationery stock. I have no idea how she figured all this out, but she spent her own, she did her own journalism on this, which was really fascinating. I mean, I recommend checking the book out. I mean, I found it really intriguing as a potential suspect in this case, because I don't know that he was ever really explored, really by police at the time, but she certainly did. So Sickert was, these are the weaknesses, okay? She does a good job of pointing out the weaknesses as well, but Sickert was in France for part of the time that the murders occurred. And that was based on some of his travel records. So, he had an alibi. He wasn't even there for some of the murders. And a lot of the experts actually reject Cornwell's theory. They say it's sensational, it lacks credible evidence, but it is an interesting theory. It's the first time somebody actually looked at, an artist's paintings and compared them to the crime scene. So, this is 1888. We don't have a whole lot of, records that are going to help us with this, but it was really an interesting theory. Okay, so the next guy that they thought might be Jack the Ripper was Prince Albert Victor. He was the Duke of Clarence. He was the grandson of Queen Victoria and second in line to the British throne. Well, that's a hell of an accusation, don't you think? So rumors fueled by later authors and conspiracy theorists suggested that the royal family orchestrated the murders, or at least the cover-up, to hide the prince's involvement with prostitutes. Well, prostitutes and, let's add in there in parentheses, secret illegitimate children, right? Because that would have been really scandalous at the time. So the supporting theories were that the royal conspiracy theorists suggested that the murders were political, and they were basically orchestrated to silence blackmailers, protect the monarchy. I mean, it sounds possible, right? But the problem, here's the problem with that theory, is that there are extensive royal records that place the prince elsewhere during some of the murders. So again, he has a pretty compelling alibi. And there was never any official investigation that treated him as a serious suspect, which, of course you can imagine why, right? That would bring all kinds of scandal and the spotlight on the royal family. But it is an interesting theory. It was one that was sort of thrown around for a while, but maybe not seriously. And now we get to the meat of the suspects, right? This is probably the one that really, that they actually believe did it. This is Aaron Kazminski. He was a 23-year-old Polish Jewish barber. He was the original suspect in the 1888 investigation. And they based it on a lot of his erratic, sort of deviant behavior, which is pretty well documented in asylum records and police notes from the time. So some of the erratic behavior that was described was auditory hallucinations. He claimed to hear voices that gave him commands, and basically they were describing classic symptoms of schizophrenia or severe psychosis at the time. He also had extreme paranoia. He claimed that people were trying to harm him or conspire against him. And the records that we have from that time period indicate that he refused to wash or eat, so he had really poor hygiene. And he showed severe self-neglect. He was basically deteriorating physically. And then he had sort of violent outbursts, which were like fits of rage, or it sounds like, what is it? It sounds like IED, that explosive disorder, which as a defense attorney I actually have used before. I think it's a real disorder. It sounds like IED, I know it's not, but anyway, there are no official records that tie him to physical violence toward others, but he reportedly had fits of rage, whatever that means, and he had an especial hatred toward women. This is apparently all documented in his asylum records, but, we don't actually know why. Like, there's not a fundamental reason for why he particularly hated women and prostitutes. Maybe he was humiliated by one. It's hard to know. But that is in the records. So according to some police memoranda, Kazminski was also known to have some kind of alliance or familiarity with Ripper's first victim, like the victim profile, the Jack the Ripper's profile. He spent long periods talking to himself or wandering aimlessly. I don't know that this makes him Jack the Ripper, guys, right? But, this is what they've documented in the asylum records, so, he must be crazy, he must be out there murdering prostitutes, right? So they said, this is actually in the records, he said he talks to himself or wanders aimlessly, often avoiding contact with others. So there is documentation that he was committed to the Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum in 1891, and then he was later transferred to Levisden Asylum, where he lived until his death in 1990. But, this is probably the most damning evidence, maybe, against him. Well, I'll get to that in a second, but at the time, his commitment occurred after the murders had stopped. So, that kind of makes him a little bit more suspect, right? And so, interestingly, though, after Kazminski was institutionalized, he never displayed any outward violence. So some actually questioned whether his earlier behavior had been misinterpreted or whether he had simply broken from reality completely, like basically had a psychotic break. But so he was basically suspect number one, right? And then there are people that have theorized that, what if there wasn't a Jack the Ripper at all? What if there were two or three? Like, what if it was a group? Or worse, what if Ripper was a myth, right? Manufactured by the media, fueled by a police force that was desperate to control a city on the verge of collapse. There is some support for the theory that there might have been more than one person who committed these murders, right? That the Ripper was a myth. So if you go back to the original crime scenes, there were 5 women. There are 5 brutal murders. But if you look really closely at each one of the crimes, a lot of it doesn't add up. So when you have, essentially a serial killer, right? Jack the Ripper was a serial killer. You usually have a particular victim profile. You have a particular, modus operandi. Like, this is how they do this each time. Sometimes if a serial killer is evolving, they might change their technique slightly. But, these were kind of different. So if you start to look closely at the crime scenes, which Patricia Cornwell does really well in her book, you have different methods of killing. So Marianne Nichols and Annie Chapman had their throats slashed and their organs removed. Elizabeth Stride had her throat cut, but she was not mutilated. And so this is where some people speculate, was the killer interrupted, or was it a different killer altogether, and they just lumped them together. And then some of the victims, looked like they had been mutilated with some kind of skill, right? I mean, it was a clean cut. But others looked sort of rushed and sloppy. They were like jagged, they're sort of like torn up like an animal might do, like maul them. And then there was timing and geography. There were 2 murders, Stride and Eddowes, who happened within 45 minutes of each other in different locations. So the big speculation is, how could one man have pulled that off? Like, how could he be in 2 locations in such a short span of time? And that's probably the most compelling evidence that there might be, more than one killer, but, or that working together, or either a copycat killer. I mean, they never really explored the idea of a copycat killer at the time, but that's one of the beliefs. So Scotland Yard, even at the time, had doubts that maybe there was just one person doing this. There were internal memos from the time that revealed that the investigators considered several suspects with no clear consensus. They were just, hunting for whomever might fit that profile. So if that's true, and there are multiple suspects, what else about this case might unravel, right? And I guess the larger question is, why revisit the nightmare now, 137 years later? Right? I mean, it's more than a century. Well, I mean, one obvious thing is science has finally caught up with the shadows of Whitechapel, right? So why not investigate, right? So here's where it gets interesting, because people have continued. They've continued to research and investigate this case because it is fascinating, it is unsolved, and it just sort of lurks out there. It's in mythology now. So in 2014, there was a forensic scientist, Russell Edwards, who purchased a blood-stained shawl at an auction. Okay, let's think about that for a second, okay? Can you imagine going to an auction and wanting to purchase a blood-stained shawl and kind of wonder, how much did that go for? Where did it come from? It turns out that the shawl belonged to victim Catherine Eddowes. So, using mitochondrial DNA, his team claimed 100% match to a living relative of Jack the Ripper's. And this is what Edwards said to reporters. This is his quote. He said, "It's very difficult to put into words the elation I felt when I saw the 100% DNA match. This brings closure, and it's a form of justice for the descendants. Ripper can't be prosecuted because he's dead, but this is the closest thing they can do. This man committed atrocities towards their ancestors, and we know it's him, and we want the courts to say, yes, you're right." While some celebrate the DNA breakthrough as closure, others question the chain of custody, the contamination risk, and the ethics of using auctioned evidence. Right, here's what the headlines didn't tell you. There is no official record that the shawl was ever at the crime scene. It wasn't cataloged by police. It passed through private hands for over a century. It was handled by collectors, family members, even displayed publicly before DNA testing. And critics argue, any modern match could have been the result of secondary transfer. So the other important thing is the DNA was mitochondrial, which means it was traced to maternal lineage, not an individual. Kazminski's relatives share that DNA with countless others, so it's suggestive, it's not definitive. But nonetheless, Russell Edwards now leads a legal campaign to force an inquest, asking the courts to officially name Aaron Kazminski as Jack the Ripper. All right, so why are we still talking about this 137 years later? Why are forensic scientists, historians, ripperologists still investing their careers, some their entire lives, trying to unmask a man who's been dead for more than a century? I mean, what's the point? What does solving this really give us? Well, let me tell you. First, it's the mystery. I mean, Jack the Ripper isn't just a killer. He is the world's greatest criminal enigma. He's a name that is so burned into our cultural memory that he feels more myth than man. But if he is a myth, then we get to move on. If he's a man, we have to confront something far more terrifying, that monsters are human, and humans walk among us. But second, it's the victims. Polly, Annie, Elizabeth, Catherine, Mary Jane. They were more than names on a police report. They were mothers, daughters, sisters, abandoned by the system that promised to protect them. So solving this isn't about the killer, it's about giving them back their stories, restoring their humanity. And ultimately, it's about the future. Because if modern science can reach back 137 years and pull truth from blood-soaked cloth, what could it do for families still waiting today? For every unsolved murder, every missing person, this case proves that it's never too late. By solving Jack the Ripper, maybe we finally stop letting monsters write history.